In 1907, an explorer picked through the ruins of a collapsed watchtower on the edge of the Chinese desert. Inside, wrapped in cloth, he found a leather mailbag of letters, sealed, addressed, never sent. One letter was written by a merchant's wife, abandoned in a foreign land, telling her husband she would rather marry a dog than him. It never reached him. For over 1600 years, her words simply waited in the dark. Sit closer and let the desert wind carry you back, not to the kings of the Silk Road, but to the ones who actually walked it. Long before it had a name, before any mapmaker called it the Silk Road, it was simply the road, and it swallowed people whole. At the start of the 4th century, two great powers anchored the known world, Han China fracturing in the east, Rome in the far west. Between them stretched thousands of miles of desert, mountain, and grassland, belonging to no single ruler at all. Through that in-between land moved something more powerful than any army, a network of trade that had run for centuries. Historians centuries later would call it the Silk Road. The people who actually walked it simply called it the road home. It carried silk westward, yes, but also glass, spices, paper, silver, ideas, prayers, and quietly entire families. No single people controlled it, but one people, more than any other, made it move. They were the Sogdians, and without them, the Silk Road might never have earned its name at all. To understand Miwnay's letter, we must first understand the people who built the roads she was abandoned on. The Sogdians came from Sogdiana, a fertile land between two great rivers in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They had no great army, no vast empire of their own. Their power was quieter and far more enduring. From childhood, Sogdian boys were taught the trades of the road, languages, numbers, and the patience to travel for years. Sogdian merchants settled not just in Samarkand, but in trading colonies strung like beads along the entire route east. Dunhuang, Yuzhang, Jincheng, Luoyang. Wherever there was trade to be had, a Sogdian community had likely already taken root there. These colonies wrote to each other constantly in their own script, carried hand to hand across 1,000 miles of empty land. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the first great information networks the world had ever known. Among the families who lived by that network was a woman named Miwnay, and the husband who would one day abandon her. But her story comes later. First, let us walk the road itself, the way every Sogdian merchant family knew it. In the east, the road began or ended at Chang'an, one of the largest cities on earth. Inside its western market, a merchant could hear a dozen languages before breakfast and smell spices from 3 continents. Here, Sogdian traders loaded their camels with bolts of silk, the one good the whole world seemed to want. A caravan could number a few dozen animals, or several hundred, guarded, insured, and financed like a small business. Before departure, prayers were offered to Buddhist spirits, to Zoroastrian fire, to whatever god a merchant trusted most with his life. Then, at first light, the gates opened, and the caravan walked out of the known world and into the road. Behind them lay comfort. Ahead lay 1,800 miles of desert, mountain, bandits, and uncertain welcome. Every merchant who took that road understood one thing clearly: he might never see his family again. West of Chang'an, the land dried into the Gansu Corridor, a narrow strip of survivable ground between two deadly wastelands. To the north lay the Gobi, to the south, the Tibetan highlands. The corridor itself was the only way through. Water was rationed by the mouthful. A dry well could mean death for the entire caravan, animals included. Sandstorms could bury a trail in minutes, swallowing the horizon whole and turning day into a choking orange dusk. Caravans traveled in the cool of early morning and late evening, resting through the worst heat of midday. At night, the desert turned bitterly cold. and merchants huddled close around small fires beneath an enormous field of stars. Guides who knew the corridors, shifting wells, and landmarks were paid more than any other member of the caravan. Get the route wrong, and the desert did not forgive. Many caravans that vanished were never found at all. And yet still they came, year after year, because the road paid for itself many times over if you survived it. At the western edge of the corridor stood Dunhuang, the last true outpost before the desert swallowed the road whole. It was a garrison town, a customs post, and a melting pot. Chinese soldiers, Sogdian merchants, and Buddhist monks side by side. Nearby, carved into desert cliffs, monks and merchants alike funded shrines asking safe passage from the road ahead. A merchant might spend a small fortune sponsoring a single painted cave in exchange for a safer crossing beyond. These Mogao caves would one day hold some of the greatest treasures of the ancient world, sealed away for centuries. Among later monks' hidden libraries, scholars would even find letters written in the Sogdian merchant's own script. But Dunhuang was more than prayer. It was where a merchant made his final decision: go on or turn back. Beyond this point lay the Taklamakan, a name later travelers translated simply as the place you do not come back from. The Taklamakan desert could be crossed only by skirting its edges, along a chain of oasis towns fed by mountain snowmelt. Even on the safer edge route, danger rode alongside every caravan in the shape of bandits watching from the dunes. Some caravans hired armed guards. Others simply traveled in numbers too large for raiders to risk attacking. A single merchant traveling alone was almost never seen again. The road rewarded caution and punished pride equally. Even without bandits, the shifting sands themselves could erase a trail overnight, burying wells and landmarks alike. Whole cities, built too close to the moving dunes, were eventually swallowed and forgotten entirely by the desert. Centuries later, explorers would find such buried cities perfectly preserved beneath the sand, frozen at the moment of abandonment. But for the merchants living it, the desert was not mystery. It was simply the price of doing business. And so they pressed on, oasis to oasis, toward the mountains that marked the road's final, hardest stretch. Kashgar rose from the desert like a promise kept, walls and gardens fed by rivers born in the mountains above. Here, caravans from every direction met, traded, rested, and reformed before continuing on toward different distant destinations. Further south, cotton was famous for one thing above all others: jade, pulled from the beds of its icy rivers. Chinese buyers prized cotton jade above almost anything else the Western Road could offer, worth its weight many times in silk. In these oasis markets, a Sogdian merchant could trade silk for jade, jade for silver, silver for glass, and glass for grain. Prices shifted daily by rumor, weather, and whichever caravan had arrived last with news from the west. A clever trader might double his fortune in a single oasis stop, or lose everything to one bad piece of advice. But no fortune mattered if the next crossing killed you. Ahead now rose the hardest wall on the entire road. The Pamir Mountains stood between the oasis cities and Sogdiana itself, so high that later travelers called them the roof of the world. The air thinned until breathing itself became labor. Camels struggled, men grew dizzy and short of breath. Frozen passes claimed careless travelers every year, their bodies sometimes found perfectly preserved by the following spring. Yet merchants still crossed, because on the far side lay home, Sogdiana, and everything the road had been leading toward. Coming down from the mountains felt like a kind of rebirth. Warmer air, the smell of orchards, familiar voices at last. For a Sogdian merchant returning home, this descent meant something no fortune could equal, simply, finally, arriving. But for those who left Sogdiana heading east, as Miwnay once did, that same mountain crossing meant only departure. Samarkand was the beating heart of it all, a city of merchants, gardens, and painted halls, wealthy beyond its modest size. Its noble houses were painted with murals of feasts, hunts, and distant lands their merchants had actually visited. Here, a young woman named Miwnay was raised in a family bound closely to the trading houses of the road. She learned early what every Sogdian child learned, that the men of her family might vanish east for years at a time. When she came of age, she was married to Nanai Dihat, a trader whose family already held a foothold far to the east. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary arrangement. Trade marriages like theirs bound merchant families across the entire network. Soon after, Nanai Dihat departed for China, promising to send for her once he was settled and established there. Eventually, word came. She was to follow him east, across the very road we have just crossed together. She could not have known then what the eastern end of that road actually held in store for her. Before we follow her further, it is worth pausing on what exactly moved along this road and why it mattered so much. Silk moved west, prized in Rome so highly it was once said to be worth its weight in gold. Chinese paper moved west too, though its secret took centuries longer to travel than the material itself. Glassware moved east, delicate and rare, packed in straw and carried thousands of miles without breaking, if the merchant was skilled. Spices, gemstones, silver coins, and horses all moved in their own directions, each valuable enough to risk the road for. But perhaps the most powerful cargo of all could not be weighed on any scale at all: belief. Buddhist monks traveled with merchant caravans east into China, carrying scripture in the very same packs as silk and silver. Zoroastrian fire priests and Manichaean teachers moved the same roads, planting new faiths in Oasis towns along the way. In this way, the Silk Road carried not just goods between two worlds, but the slow, patient exchange of entire civilizations. And carried within all of it quietly were the ordinary people whose lives the goods depended on entirely. Miwnay's own crossing followed the same road we have just walked: Samarkand, the Pamirs, the Oasis towns, the desert corridor. She traveled with her young daughter, Shane, and whatever family members could be spared to accompany her. Every oasis, every mountain pass, every desert stretch we described was, to her, simply the road to her husband. When she finally reached the Chinese frontier, she expected to find Nanai Dihat waiting, established, ready to receive her. Instead, she found something far less certain: a man often absent, frequently traveling, and increasingly difficult to rely upon. The records do not tell us exactly why he left her behind so often. Business, perhaps, or something less easily excused. What we do know is that Miwnay found herself, again and again, managing alone in an unfamiliar frontier town. She was far from Samarkand, far from her family's protection, dependent entirely on a husband who kept disappearing east and west. This was the life of many merchant wives along the Silk Road, a life spent waiting in places that were never quite home. The town where Miwnay lived sat at the edge of Chinese authority, a garrison post more than a true city. Soldiers, officials, refugees, and foreign traders all mixed uneasily within its walls, tied together only by distance from anywhere else. Sogdian families like Miwnay's kept close together here, sharing news, lending money, and marrying within their own small community. Letters were the only thread connecting them back to Samarkand, carried by whichever trusted courier happened to be heading west. Miwnay wrote often to her mother back home, describing her hardships in careful, restrained language, as was expected. She managed as best she could, trading small goods, borrowing where necessary, raising her daughter far from any family support. For years, this uneasy, difficult life continued, not comfortable, but survivable, held together by the fragile rhythm of the trade network. Then, in the year 311, something happened far to the east that would break that fragile rhythm entirely. Luoyang was one of the great capitals of the Chinese world, a city the entire trade network ultimately depended upon. For years, the ruling Jin dynasty had weakened, torn by rebellion, rival princes, and uprisings among peoples along its borders. In the year 311, forces led by rebellious frontier leaders finally broke through and seized the capital itself. What followed, later chroniclers recorded, was catastrophe. The city burned, its markets emptied, its people scattered or slaughtered. Historians would later call it the disaster of Yongjia, one of the deadliest collapses in early Chinese history. For the Sogdian trade network, the disaster was catastrophic in an entirely different way. It broke the road itself. Merchants in Luoyang were killed or scattered. Trade caravans could no longer safely pass through the region at all. Word of the disaster reached the frontier towns slowly, carried by refugees fleeing west with whatever they could carry. For Miwnay, already struggling, the news meant something devastatingly personal. The network she depended on had collapsed. Worse still, Nanai Dihat, wherever he actually was, seemed to have simply stopped sending word or money at all. With the trade network broken, Miwnay's situation grew desperate in a way it had never been before. Her small trading income dried up along with the disrupted caravans. Prices for food rose sharply in the chaos. She had a young daughter to feed, no husband present, and no guaranteed way to reach her family for help. In her later letters, she would describe considering the unthinkable, becoming a servant, simply to survive the coming winter. She wrote to her mother of her shame and desperation, careful even then not to burden her family too heavily. But to Nanai Dihat, her tone shifted entirely, from patience to frustration to something close to fury. She told him plainly that she would rather be married to a dog or a pig than to him, abandoned as she was. It was not melodrama. It was the plain, furious grief of a woman who had crossed half a continent for a promise unkept. In total, Miwnay and others in her frontier community wrote several letters that autumn, meant for recipients far to the west. One described, in vivid detail, the burning of Luoyang, likely the earliest surviving eyewitness account of the disaster. Another, from Miwnay herself, poured out years of frustration, poverty, and abandonment onto paper, addressed to Nanai Dihat directly. A third was addressed to her mother, softer in tone, asking only for whatever help could still reach her. These letters, along with others from unrelated merchants in the same community, were gathered together for a westbound courier. The courier's job was simple in theory: carry the bag west, along the very road we have already crossed, until it reached Samarkand. He never completed that journey. We do not know exactly why: bandits, disorder, disease, or simple misfortune along the way. What we do know is that the mailbag ended up inside a watchtower along the frontier wall and was never opened again. Whatever happened to the courier, Miwnay's furious, desperate words never once reached the man they were written for. Nanai Dihat, wherever he truly was, likely lived out his life, never knowing exactly what his wife had endured or written. The watchtower where the letters waited was part of an old defensive wall, already falling into disuse by the time they arrived. As decades passed, the wall crumbled further. Sand crept in through broken windows. The garrison that once staffed it moved on. The mailbag sat undisturbed the entire time, tucked into a dry alcove that happened to protect it from moisture and decay. Centuries turned, dynasties rose and fell across China. Sogdiana itself was eventually absorbed into new empires entirely. The Sogdian language itself eventually faded from daily use, remembered only in scattered inscriptions and forgotten letters. Through all of it, Miwnay's furious, heartbroken words remained exactly where the courier had left them, entirely unread. No one alive still remembered her name, her daughter's name, or the husband she had crossed a continent to find. In 1907, a Hungarian-British explorer named Aurel Stein was surveying the ruins of the old frontier wall for the British Museum. Stein had already uncovered remarkable treasures nearby, including a hidden library sealed inside the Mogao cave complex. But inside one collapsed watchtower, his team found something different: a bag of letters, never opened, never delivered. The letters were written in a script scholars did not immediately recognize, in a language few could read at all. It would take decades of careful work by linguists to finally translate what came to be called the Sogdian ancient letters. Among them, scholars eventually identified Miwnay's furious words to her absent husband, preserved exactly as she had written them. For the first time in over 1600 years, someone finally read what she had needed her husband to hear. It arrived far too late to help her, but it arrived at last to someone, and perhaps that mattered too. We do not know what became of Miwnay after that final letter, whether she found work, family aid, or simply endured. We do not know if her daughter, Shane, grew up safely, or what life along that hard frontier eventually gave her. The Silk Road is remembered in most tellings for its silk, its empires, its emperors and generals and grand exchanges. But it was built, mile by mile, by ordinary families like hers, risking everything for a life that was never guaranteed. For every merchant who returned wealthy, countless others simply vanished into distance, disease, disaster, or heartbreak, unremembered. Miwnay's letter survived only by chance, sealed by accident in a forgotten bag, preserved by dry desert air alone. For every letter like hers that survived, countless others were lost entirely, their writers' names gone from history forever. Somewhere beneath that same desert sand, the bones of that road still remain: wells, watchtowers, and waiting places. And somewhere within all of it, a young Sogdian wife once wrote her heart onto paper and simply hoped it would be enough. Sleep now and let the desert wind carry her words the rest of the way, 1600 years late, but carried at last.